2 hours ago, something happened in Ottawa that Washington never modeled, never war-gamed, and never believed was possible. Mark Carney signed a sweeping bilateral trade framework with Beijing. Not a preliminary memo. Not a letter of intent. A finalized operational agreement that immediately slashes Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, while China simultaneously lifts its embargo on Canadian canola, wheat, and critical minerals. In one move, Carney rewired North American trade geometry in a way that no tariff, no executive order, and no Supreme Court ruling can undo. And the timing was not accidental. It was surgical. Here is the context Washington does not want you to fully understand. Just weeks ago, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the sweeping tariffs Trump imposed on Canada and Mexico under the IEEPA were unlawful. Tariffs reaching 47% on Canadian goods struck down. A significant legal defeat for the White House. But Trump did not retreat. He pivoted immediately to Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, a rarely used provision that allows a president to impose a flat 10% tariff on all imports from all countries simultaneously, justified under balance of payments grounds. The administration rolled it out as a global measure. Every country on Earth hit at once. The legal exposure reduced. The economic pressure maintained. Wall Street started quietly pricing in what a sustained 10% across-the-board tariff does to inflation, to consumer prices, to corporate margins. The numbers were not comfortable, but the White House believed it had found a durable mechanism, a way to keep pressure on Canada without the legal vulnerability. They believed Carney was cornered with fewer options, diminishing allies, and an economy slowly being squeezed into compliance. They were wrong on every single count. The White House expected the tariff math to eventually break Ottawa. They expected Canadian exporters to flood Parliament with pressure. They expected business coalitions to demand quiet concessions. They expected Carney to privately signal flexibility, to offer a face-saving compromise, to play defense. That is the playbook of a government that has run out of moves. Carney did not play that game. He had been preparing a different board entirely. 45 minutes ago, Carney walked to the podium at the National Press Theatre in Ottawa. Flanking him were Canada's Minister of Trade, the Chinese ambassador to Canada, and senior representatives from Canada's agricultural and mining sectors. No advance notice had been given to Washington. The State Department learned of the announcement when a Reuters alert hit their phones. What Carney laid out in the next 11 minutes reorganized the economic landscape of North America. The agreement has 3 operational pillars. First, Canada is immediately reducing its tariff on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to 22.5%, matching the European Union's current rate rather than mirroring the American punitive level. In exchange, Beijing is lifting all retaliatory tariffs on Canadian canola and wheat, which had been suspended since 2019 and had cost Canadian agricultural exporters an estimated $2.6 billion annually. Those markets reopen immediately. Second, China is removing its informal embargo on Canadian critical minerals, specifically lithium, cobalt, and nickel, allowing two-way flow that benefits Canadian mining operations while giving Beijing access to North American-sourced supply chains for its domestic battery and technology manufacturing. Third, the two countries are establishing a joint infrastructure investment corridor, with Chinese capital committed to new deep-water port expansion on Canada's Pacific coast at Prince Rupert, British Columbia. The terminal, when complete, will increase Canadian export throughput capacity by 340,000 tons annually. This is not theoretical. Ground surveys were completed months ago. But this is where it gets serious. Because the element of this deal that has genuinely alarmed officials inside the Pentagon and the NSC is not the canola. It is not even the cobalt. It is the electric vehicles. Modern electric vehicles are not simply transportation. They are networked computing platforms on wheels. They carry forward-facing cameras, rear cameras, side sensors, microphones, GPS modules, and persistent cellular connectivity. They upload data continuously. And when Chinese-manufactured vehicles, or vehicles assembled in China and re-exported, begin entering the North American market in volume through a Canadian tariff gateway, the question that American intelligence officials are now asking internally is not theoretical. It is operational. Where does that data go? Who has access to it? And what happens when tens of thousands of those vehicles begin crossing the Ambassador Bridge from Windsor into Detroit, or moving through Buffalo, or traveling along the interstate corridors that run through northern border states? The Pentagon has flagged this exact scenario in internal assessments. A former senior CIA official, speaking to a national security outlet this week, described Chinese-manufactured vehicles operating near sensitive American facilities as a collection platform the size of a civilian fleet. That is the frame the White House is now working inside. And Carney just opened the door. Now here is why the American business reaction has been immediate and alarmed. Ford and General Motors spent 3 years repositioning around the assumption that Chinese EV manufacturers face prohibitive tariff walls in North America. That assumption just changed. If BYD, SAIC, or NIO can ship vehicles to Canadian assembly partners, qualify under adjusted content thresholds, and enter the broader North American market at competitive price points, the business model American automakers rebuilt their futures around collapses. The United Auto Workers issued a statement within the hour calling the agreement a direct threat to American manufacturing jobs. Privately, executives at 3 major Detroit area suppliers said that if this structure holds, every capital investment projection for the next decade needs to be rewritten. What the White House is confronting right now is not simply a trade deal. It is the collapse of a strategic assumption. For decades, American policy has operated on the premise that Canada and Mexico function as an integrated North American economic zone that effectively operates inside American strategic orbit. The USMCA was not just a trade agreement. It was a framework that kept both neighbors close, economically entangled, and diplomatically aligned. What Carney has just done is demonstrate that alignment has limits. That when American tariff pressure becomes structurally unsustainable, Canada has other options. Real ones. Finalized ones. Ones that were negotiated quietly over 11 months while Washington believed the pressure was working. A senior trade economist at the Peterson Institute told Bloomberg this morning that the deal represents a rupture in the assumption that North America is a closed strategic system. It is not closed anymore. Carney just proved it. The Canadian dollar strengthened 2.8% within 90 minutes of the announcement. The Toronto Stock Exchange Agriculture Index rose 6.1%. Chinese EV-related equities listed in Hong Kong surged on the news. Meanwhile, American automaker stocks dropped sharply. The S&P 500 erased gains from the prior 2 sessions in under an hour. Trump now faces 3 options, and none of them resolve cleanly. He can escalate by threatening additional tariffs or trade barriers targeting Canada's new Chinese partnerships, but doing so raises the risk of pushing Canada further into Beijing's economic orbit while simultaneously alienating American agricultural exporters, automakers, and critical mineral consumers who depend on stable Canadian supply. He can attempt a legal challenge arguing the agreement violates USMCA provisions around third-party trade relationships, but legal proceedings take years, and the economic reality of the deal is already in motion. Or he can seek to negotiate directly with Ottawa, which is what Carney has been signaling from the beginning was the only path that made sense. But negotiating now means doing so from a position of demonstrably reduced leverage, after a Supreme Court defeat, after a failed tariff strategy, and after Canada just signed a landmark deal with the country Washington considers its primary strategic competitor. Carney addressed the press for 3 minutes after the signing. He did not gloat. He did not perform. He said one thing that will define the framing of this moment. Canada makes trade decisions in the interest of Canadians. We always have. We always will. He turned and walked back inside. 2 hours ago, the White House believed its 10% global tariff was the ceiling of Canadian pain tolerance. 2 hours later, Carney answered with Beijing. Trump wanted to isolate Canada economically. He handed Canada the justification it needed to diversify. He wanted to prove that American tariff pressure was irresistible. He proved it was navigable. And at the center of Washington's growing alarm tonight is a recognition that is settling in slowly but unmistakably. Canada was not cornered. It was waiting. And the move it just made will take years for America to undo, if it can be undone at all. The neighbor did not blink. The neighbor signed. If this opened your eyes, hit like, share this with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next.